Well, thanks very much, David. It's great to be here. The first in-person event for me for a long time. My name is Christina Mallin. I'm with South Pole and I'm in our agricultural value chains team. South Pole, since 2019, is also the platform coordinator for the Coalition of Private Investment in Conservation. Can we go to the next slide?
Yes.
That's even better. So here you see all our members, and that's been a journey. The Coalition for Private Investment and Conservation was founded in 2016. This year it's the 5th anniversary. The coalition was founded at the last World Conservation Congress in Hawaii, 2016, different time. And over these last 5 years, CPIC has really been focusing on the question, how do you bring private investment or the private finance sector together with projects, and how do we make this work? So what we do at CPIC, we are a global multi-stakeholder platform, and you look at the enabling conditions. And here we heard already in the title of this session, it's about how to make money. It's about return-seeking investment in conservation. As I mentioned, we're now by a good 90 plus members from really different parts of the world, and that really compensates project developers, so those who implement projects on the ground, as well as financial institutions or those advising them. So I will leave it here and just tell you that on CPIC, we've been working on a number of very interesting things over the years. So what I put up here is our report and the public launch and the conservation finance report, in which we delve into the question, where is the market right now? What are the questions? And what are we going to see in the future? And I'm just going to nitpick one detail, which I find interesting, maybe for this audience. We know that at the moment, there's a big question on what will be the impact framework. How will we measure biodiversity in the future? And what, for example, we found in our research for the report was there's a bit of a difference of what the private finance sector wants from a framework, mainly standardized, everybody understands it. There's one way of doing things, and what currently project developers are focusing on, which is what is the best way to monitor and which indicators exactly. So the standardization questions we saw is not yet so much, for example, on the mind of project developers. I'm taking this as an example where the private investor side and the project developers both think that one thing is a bit of a challenge, but approach it from different angles and need to talk with each other to actually find an answer to it. And the other thing that we're doing at CPIC, which I'm so excited to have panelists with me here from with experience also in East Africa, is we are looking at regional hubs for CPIC on the ground, what is needed to really bring more private investment into conservation. We have on a global level with the Nature Plus Accelerator Fund, one of CPIC-inspired initiative that really looks at accelerating projects globally. But we are now really curious to also hear how we could do that in a more local concept, though, of course, East Africa is not exactly small. So I'm really excited to be here with my two other panelists and hear from you also. What do you think is needed? What are your questions at the moment? Why do we not have as many projects that are supported by the private sector as you would like to see? And I think that's it from me, David.
Yes, but before you stop, can you just tell us a little bit more about the Accelerator Plus and when we have a session on that?
Of course. What is the Nature Plus Accelerator? So CPIC has started with doing blueprints. That means a report, a short 2-pager, a few more pages. They're on our homepage explaining what does a conservation deal look like, so that an investor who does not understand yet what they should look in a biodiversity deal gets a better idea. And at the other side, that a project developer who is not yet working with the private sector starts understanding what the private investor is looking like. Now, those were knowledge products. This was about informing the sector. The Nature Plus Accelerator goes one step further, where we are actually already having, we're very excited to have IUCN and Mirova managing this Nature Plus Accelerator Fund that is currently in the launch phase and will actually be supporting projects on the ground, especially also early stage projects. And what we are so excited about as CPIC is that, of course, as a community of practice, we will be able to take the learnings from the Nature Plus Accelerator Fund and help make sure that it helps the CPIC community as a whole to learn from this and to really help get more projects, the private finance that work in conservation finance. So, and the session, and we are really talking about the impact framework, there is tomorrow, but I have to admit, David, you have to remind me what time exactly.
Don't remember.
I think it is 4:30. I think it is 4:30.
The Nature Plus Accelerator? Yeah, I think you're right. 4 maybe.
4 or 4:30, you will have Emilia Kralasevic from IUCN, who will talk about the impact framework perspective from her side, and Edith Kish from Miroba of why this is also an exciting opportunity for Miroba.
Excellent.
At 4 o'clock. Great. So
Okay,
4 o'clock
thank you.
tomorrow here to hear more about Nature Plus.
Great. Thank you, Christina. Really appreciate that.
Great.
Let's maybe move to the other panelists as just some introductory words. Can you tell us, tell the audience just briefly, you know, what your engagement is with entrepreneurship and conservation entrepreneurship, and what you're hoping for in the next few years, and then just, you know, short introduction, and then we'll sort of open things up a little bit. So
yeah, no, thanks so much, David. Well, first and foremost, you know, it's such a pleasure to be here. I think that's such a, you know, interesting topic, and as a matter of fact, I think that's the holy grail, right? Like, how can we actually sort of unlock those new sources of revenue that generate not only socio-economic outcomes, but also those conservation outcomes, right? Because at the end of the day, 2030, it's like next door. Science tells us that basically we have like 1 decade, and we need to turn and shift things around so that we can make those economy become regenerative economy, so that they actually, the more they grow, the more they actually help us achieve that. In my case, my name is Thomas. I work for IUCN. I'm the regional sort of head for coastal and marine conservation in Eastern and Southern Africa. So my turf is the ocean, is the blue economy. Now, in our region, the blue economy is very much more a concept or an idea than a reality. And yet, at the global level, actually, there's a lot of interest, momentum. You see those like global funds for coral reef or for the oceans and this and that. There's like lots of millions that they want to pour into those bankable projects, right? Now go to the field and try to find those bankable projects. They don't exist. They just literally don't exist. The only thing that you might sort of find is like a few lodge here and there, but nothing really at scale, and certainly not sort of also on all the value chain. There is just nothing. And yet all the reports, all the scoping assessment, they say this is the new El Dorado. So now the big question is, okay, well, at least in our region, again, I'm just going to talk about my region because that's what I know. The blue economy is probably where the green economy was like 20, 30 years ago, maybe even 40 years ago. Now, again, science tells us we don't have 40 years to make it happen. We have like now 9 years, basically. So how can we accelerate that? So here in my program, we've come up with this sort of blue entrepreneurship approach that literally aims at accelerating this sort of development, driving it, and really sort of unlocking the regenerative potential of that blue economy. So how do we do that? Actually, so because it needs to be holistic, because it's really sort of building an entire sort of new sector, it needs to have like a very holistic and sort of several pillars. So one of them is really about building the business skills capacity of local entrepreneurs. And here that means like, you know, farmers, seaweed farmers, fishermen, they need to understand that, you know, they need to understand their business, because at the end of the day, it's business what they do. They go fish, they sell products from the ocean, and eventually they need to understand that, you know, it's better not to spend more time or more money on fuel than what you're actually going to get out of the sea. Things very basic, even like sort of like financial management, etc. So that's one thing, because at the end of the day, those entrepreneurs will be the future entrepreneurs of tomorrow and the successful one. And that's absolutely key. It needs to be locally embedded and really anchor into sort of those local communities. So that's one thing that we're going to do. Now, the other thing that we're going to do, we're also going to provide sort of incubation type of support. And as a matter of fact, today, I'm happy to announce that we're going to set up the very first Seascape Blue Economy Incubator in Tanzania. And we're going to very soon launch another one in Mozambique, which actually already sort of is targeted to those already entrepreneurs that are a bit more evolved, so sort of are ready for incubation. and try to actually get them to be more like sort of business oriented and really like better at what they do. So eventually one day they will become bankable, right? So this is about sort of providing incubation support and access to finance and the right type of finance. That is absolutely key. Because at the end of the day, when you look at the financial sector existing, at least in Africa, well, you know, if an entrepreneur needs to pay like 50% of interest rate on something, then the reality is that they will never get the right level of capital to actually sort of build a proper conservation enterprise. It's just impossible. Try to build a house without money, you won't get a house. You know, you won't get a business going. That's just plain simple. So that's, and it might be, you know, very simplistic, but that's just the reality. Now, the third pillar is, all right, like let's take, for instance, the value chain of seaweed. Seaweed is a big thing in the region, like everybody is going after that, etc. Lots of potential. Science tells us, yeah, it can sequester carbon, it can be a good thing for the ecosystem, for the fisheries, can be a nursery, etc. Now, thing is, right now, as it is, it's slavery, literally. I mean, like those ladies, because it's mainly ladies, they go every day under the sun, they break their back, and they literally like earn just cents on a dollar for the kilos, and usually like they eventually sort of sell it to those Southeast Asia resale. Anyway, so it doesn't work. So now the question is, and there is like thousands of those farmers already existing. So we need to support them and we need to improve the production so that it's good quality and it's at the scale and the type of seaweed that needed. But that's one thing. Then comes the other part, which is, for instance, the post-harvest. And here, there is opportunities to actually establish what we've called ocean ventures that would be run professionally, really like for a private sector, for-profit type of business that would handle the post-harvest and access to markets. So that's just one example. So we came up, and because there's so many of those possibilities and opportunities, we're gonna now establish what we've called an ocean venture studio, which literally will act as sort of a startup factory, an ocean venture factory that will analyze the value chain, find those sweet spots where there is a gap, something missing that can be filled by a specific business model, a startup, and we'll actually run it. So we'll right from the ground, so we go from the ideation to the incubation and actually sort of building the startup so that it actually serves the purpose of the farmers, in that case for seaweed, but also provide access to market and, you know, basically sort of improve the whole value chain. So that's more or less what we are up to. And the last, but very important, it's also about building the ecosystem of partners. You know, at the end of the day, because those, we don't want to reinvent the wheel every time or sort of have to redo or relook at what people have already done. We need to bring as many people, from scientists to financial sector to experts and everything, and business people, so that we can unlock the power of the network, the knowledge, and the finance. I'm gonna just stop here. You know.
Thomas, thank you. That sounds great, and very excited about what you're doing. And we'll hear more about it. I want to highlight how challenging it is, you know, to try to have an impact. When you're starting a business, you know, oftentimes it takes 2 years, 3 years, 5 years to even get traction. And here we want these businesses to actually have an impact and make money. And it's tough. So anyway, passing it to Carl here, because you've had some direct experience in this. You're trying to develop a lot of conservation enterprises around Mount Mulanje. So
thank you.
Tell us.
So my name is Carl Bruessow. I'm director of a conservation trust fund at Mount Mulanje in southern Malawi. It's a protected area. Okay, there's a bit of a story there. Why do we want to get into business? Now, the pressure in East Africa, for example, is around the protected areas. You have communities that are fairly remote, because most protected areas are remote, who have a very basic livelihood, very subsistence type of livelihood, and yet you're sitting on a whole lot of resources. Now, typically in Africa, you will have a wildlife kind of sector approach or a forestry sector approach, and you might have a bit of tourism in there, but that's about as far as it goes. So what we did is we worked with MIT, and we did an economic evaluation of the mountain. Everything but not the mining resources. And we came up with 10 resources and services that had value. And we looked at them and how they could be used in different ways with local markets, international markets, etc. And then started planning on involving business in a way in which it returns in some way meaningful benefit to both the community and to conservation, and proactively and underlined and in bold. We're not going into business for the sake of going into business. We're going into business because we see that commerce is generally a very efficient type of organization. It seeks profit, but with the right intention, they are very efficient with resources, and they can really add value in many different ways to what you're doing as a conservation organization on a mountain, or how you're working with a community. So yeah, what we found here is that water, forestry, biodiversity, tourism, and energy is valuable to us, but there are others as well. And we're always looking for these conservation, community, and commerce linkages. Each one of the sectors that we have a forum that has these different stakeholders in. And we have business planning for each sector. So we know where the opportunities are, and we are exploring how to attract companies to come in to work, and how those companies will work in the first place with communities to scale. Because there's another thing about doing business. If it doesn't involve anything to scale, then you're not really involving the people around the mountain. It becomes something that's a little bit irrelevant. So we're always looking for something that involves a lot of people. This is our mountain down here. You can see it's very steep on the outside. We're surrounded by the oldest tea estates in Africa, and tea has been a big win-win with us. We're in there with Rainforest Alliance, and what we did is we took tea from the estates to smallholders. There was no smallholder tea work in Malawi before that. So we worked with Fair Trade and with Rainforest Alliance to set up an association, and there's now more than 20,000 smallholders growing tea on the steep slopes where there was a lot of erosion before. So the tea keeps the soil in the place. We got 20,000 people earning an income. There's a developmental premium coming back that does all sorts of other things for them that benefits them. And we know those 20,000 people, because of the Rainforest Alliance certification, are not going to touch the mountain because that's in their contract. Next. Okay, so really at the end of the day, we are talking at a local level about organizing the potential businesses in a very simple way. I mean, we first go out there and say, like, is there a customer or a market that's interested? This is, I mean, for us that are in conservation, this is very simple, but you have to remind yourself, because I see a lot of people that I work with, first of all say, oh, I've got a huge resource. This is wonderful. Let's start doing something with it. But supply-driven business doesn't work. You have to find the market first and work back. But as I say, right at the bottom, you also have to know what that product is and then work out in between, like how to get it out there. And if you've got a supply chain that works, that's there, or you can piggyback on it, you're much better off. And producers, that is where involving the community becomes absolutely critical. And we're always looking for something that involves 20,000 to 30,000 people. We have 500,000 people living in our transition zone. We're a biosphere reserve. 500,000 people within 7 kilometers. They have to be doing something, because otherwise, if there's a climate shock or there's a problem with whatever agricultural product they're producing, then they'll turn to the mountain as a coping mechanism. And the first thing is we lose another forest. So that's a very simple way of looking at business, but it doesn't matter whether it's carbon. I've just met for the first time my partner in Europe that we have a carbon trade with around local cook stoves, and that business applies to that. You know, they're part of the supply chain, and Swiss Carbon Value is where we go. And I don't know where they sell that on. I don't even know who those customers are, but it works. And we get the funds back in Malawi. But that can be to do with tourism. It can be do with honey. It can be do with natural products. You just carry on all the way through. You're looking for the business to come and work with you. We partner with them. We look for the add-on benefits of certification. We look for anything else that can help people have better livelihoods, better lifestyles, and therefore, at the end of the day, we have better conservation. Thanks.
Really fascinating approaches. So I'm seeing everything from the venture studio with Toma, you know, which is really starting out with the idea and creating a business from scratch, the accelerator, which is able to help finance some businesses, and a lot of the work that CPIC is doing to try to replicate ideas that are already out there working. And then, you know, Carl, you're sort of saying, how do we scale this? And one of the points that I think is interesting to make is that oftentimes partnering with larger companies could be a way, because they have the demand. They often don't understand their supply chain. They have potential reputational risk and supply flow risk. And so they could be really great partners to help, you know, buy your products and get that scale that's needed. Just a little background on me. So I didn't even introduce myself at the beginning. I figure you all know me by now, but I'm David Meyers. I'm the executive director of the Conservation Finance Alliance. And I've done a lot of entrepreneurial work myself, starting several businesses, including a bamboo flooring factory in Madagascar, which was a little crazy, and an impact investing financial services company, which was before its time. But what the CFA is also launching, well, we've done one round of incubation. We're focusing on businesses that are conservation finance oriented and could be nonprofits and stuff. We're going to do another one. There's a session today, I think at 4, where we're going to talk about that. So if you're interested in that, but I just want to sort of maybe already open it up to the floor and see if people have questions for you to start with. And then I'd like to maybe get some ideas. If you're a conservation entrepreneur and you have an idea that you want to pitch to the panel here and get some feedback on, this is a great opportunity for it. So we have some expertise and some experience here and interest. So any questions to start off with? Anyone but Olivier.
I was very interested because you said that a business has to be profitable, has to be a real business. And you talk also about isolated local communities. I worked with L'Occitane on the shea butter value chain. And it was interesting because they were using 14,000 women production. But when we get to the level, should we target the women working around the protected area instead of the women working just anywhere in the bush? Then it has a most important cost to go further, because you need a truck to go on the dirt roads to go to pick it up. So it's more costly than the fair trade and organic shea butter that you can find from everywhere. How do you deal with this? Because you're not competitive.
So that's a great question. And one thing I didn't say about our organization is we're a conservation trust fund. So we have money, and we can use that money in a way in which we can put it into shareholding in a company, or we can provide a guarantee, or we can provide collateral. Now, what we can do and what we do with those businesses is we look where the blocks are. We look where there's a lock and we unlock it. So let's say, for example, tourism. Often, let's say 20 years ago, the mountain wasn't really known. In fact, the only place I ever found it was in Lonely Planet's book, amazing book that's called it's called something like Places in the Middle of Nowhere or something. And that was about as famous as we got, you know. So we spent a lot of money to raise the publicity, okay, of the mountain. So we did a lot of marketing, good photographs in places. We did that ourselves because we put our image out there, and we helped the marketing. That brought companies in that said, okay, this is interesting. And people have said, where are we going to stay? We provided a small public-private partnership service called Info Mulanje that told tourists how to hike up the mountain, because it's not easy. It's difficult to get up mountains. It's an ecotourism business, so you're dealing with guides and porters and the right kind of people, but you do need to add something to that. So that's the benefit of being a conservation trust fund. We can put a bit of money in certain places to help that, and that definitely attracts business, and we listen to them closely.
Great question. Sorry, I don't have that mask here.
Thank you. So this is to Carl. I'm very much interested in your presentation. Yes.
Okay, go.
Yes, so thank you. I just wanted to ask about your basics for business. Not many landscapes or potentially protected areas have commodities that have interest for the market and customers, but also need to be conserved one way or the other. And there might not also be a conservation trust in many cases to hold this up, but you want to get something running. Must you always start with the market and customers? Because there's not always a market for certain products, but you must do something. And you need also a business approach to get this done. How do you approach that?
Okay, so I heard half your question. But you're asking about, do you have to, in the mic. Sorry, you're asking, do you always have to have a market?
Let me just rephrase it.
Yes.
So what do you do if there's no obvious market? You know, there's no sort of funder like a trust fund, but you've got value there, resources. How do you build up an opportunity there?
So that study we did with MIT on the economic values to the environment and the resources was critical. Yes, we all have a sense of, you know, water is valuable or energy is valuable. These things are valuable, but you still have to understand, can somebody, we have an electricity company. Yeah, we are probably the only conservation organization in the world that owns an electricity company. But that's all well and good, and people want electricity, but can that company make business in a rural part of Africa is the question. You have tariff controls, you got regulatory controls, you got all sorts of other controls you have to be mindful of, but somebody has to tell you, yes, it can be done, because at the end of the day, you have to sell it and make money. So you need to understand who your customer is and whether they can afford to pay for it or what it is. If I am starting to produce a very good essential oil that's going to go into the French perfume market, I am looking at something that's very specialist, that's small in quantity, but very high in value. I have to look very carefully in France to see who is my market, because it's one organization. I don't want to sell to 5. I want to give that one company the opportunity to invest and then build that story. So the market is critical, because otherwise there isn't the return of revenue. But you've got to do your homework, and that's around business planning. As I said before, each one of those sectors, each one of those resources has a business plan of what is important. From that, we can share, and businesses are on that platform. So if they are not interested in doing it, they'll find somebody else. There's always somebody who wants to make a profit if the business is viable.
Hi, thank you. I'm from World Agroforestry, ICRAF, C4 ICRAF. So my question is, actually, I'm involved with some projects with IUCN, developing proposals for GCF, Green Climate Fund, to address restoration. It's a chicken and egg situation, you know. To do our homework, you need funds as well. And we're talking of restoring degraded landscapes with tree-based interventions, trees which take 25 to 15 to 30 years before the products come. I'm trying to understand, where do we get this homework funding from?
I think that's a question that at CPIC we ask ourselves quite often. How do we actually get things off the ground? And that's where Nature Plus comes in. That's where then also our project of looking at a regional hub from CPIC comes in. So there are funds available to really do the kind of studies that are needed. That can be in due diligence, for example. How do we figure out what land ownership looks like for a specific project? Always a big question, and others. So, and that's where we really find it's interesting to look at 2 sides. You have the private sector, which, as you say, comes in later, once it's done, once the project it's really ready to go. But other organizations, the philanthropic sector, the development aid organizations, we need to get them on board on in exactly that kind of time, on foundations, making aware that these early stage in investments are really what are needed right now to build the pipeline. And then it's exciting to see that something like the CPIC East Africa Hub really providing that kind of support on the ground. Like, exactly how do you make a business work? We know it's going to take time, but we are also seeing that now actually development organizations and foundation philanthropic organizations, when you explain to them yes, they are providing a grant for a business, but that business is going to have conservation outcomes, biodiversity outcomes. They are starting to be interested, but it's key to frame it like that. If you tell them, well, you're just investing in a company, it's hard. But if you explain that, yes, there will be impact for conservation, we know how, and we have a business model, and there will be also financial sustainability in the future, they start to listen, but they're not listening enough yet. So I think that's one of the messages with CPIC, we want to really emphasize, we want to elevate, and that's why we're here and also talk at events like that to make sure that also the development aid sector hears us.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing, which is that when you look at conservation, you know, and you say we got a protected area here or an area you want to conserve, which means we don't cut the trees down, we don't harvest the fish, we don't, right? So how do you get a revenue stream out of that, right? That's the biggest question. And there's very limited revenue streams. There's carbon, there's tourism. These are, you know, non-exploitative revenue streams, but that's kind of limited. But if you look at what the pressures are on that site, there's where you see a lot more interesting opportunities, like in sustainable agriculture, in sustainable forestry, even things like that, where you can exploit, but in a better way than it's currently being used. And by taking those actions that are currently harming the site and turning them into something that has at least a neutral effect, there's actually opportunities to invest and produce revenue and return. So anyway, you had a question.
Hi, so thank you first of all, because this session is really interesting. So I have kind of two questions. The major one is, we talk about different types of support for, you know, business, organization, startup at the very beginning. My question is, this type of support are for developing country or other countries can access to? Because, for example, I come from the Mediterranean region. I am Italian, so Italy is considered a developed country, but it's true that the Mediterranean Sea is one of the hotspot for marine biodiversity, but also one of the most overexploited sea in the world. So there is a lot of work to do also in a region like, for example, the Mediterranean, but sometimes I find that we don't have accessibility, for example, to this type of training. So I come from an NGO perspective, but one thing I think that I develop in my life is the fact that I can see where is the gap. And sometimes an idea is a business related idea to provide a solution for that. But I don't know where to start. Like, I don't have the background. So that's my question. Actually, it's a practical one. It's I guess that many organizations will feel the same. So if you can answer it.
This is your first venture.
That's right. Yeah. No, and that is exactly why we came up with this model of venture studio. Because a venture studio, the whole point is to actually sort of bring on board those co-founders, so like local entrepreneurs that will run the business. Now, what we do is we basically sort of provide support, the technical support, so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Because otherwise, the big issue, and you'll see, actually, when most of the factor of failure for entrepreneurs is because they are alone. They don't have the right type of support. They don't have the right network. They don't have the right type, the access to the finance. We provide all of this. So basically, I'm not going to say that we do 80% of the job, because actually sort of the real job is the entrepreneurs who's going to have to do it. But we make it easy, or as easy as it can get, right?
But is in Africa or it's worldwide? Yours is in Africa now.
In my case, yeah. Now, honestly, it's an approach that can be replicated anywhere. It doesn't need to be Africa. It doesn't need to be, it can be global. Now, in my case, it's because I'm based there and that's what we do. And,
so
if there's people who wants to
replicate.
replicate.
Center for Mediterranean Cooperation, and we managed maybe to implement something similar also in the Mediterranean region.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think maybe from an European experience, one thing that the European Union has done is work with Climate Kick. So that's really focusing on innovation on landscape level. I've been involved in a few workshops, for example. Where was it? in Bologna, where we talked about accelerations and hubs and how could that work. So there is actually European Union is quite active in that space on fostering entrepreneurship from an early stage. So I think for Italy specifically, Climate Kick might be something you want to look into for training from an investment side. Also happy to follow up with you on that afterwards. But there are others. So from CPIC side, we also have Blueprint example, also from the global north. Especially, for example, forestry in one way or another is seen as really important in that area. Environmental impact bonds are something that you'll see more in the global north than in this global south at the moment. So they're definitely ideas, and that's not at all, as Thomas said, an idea that should be seeing to the global south, but absolutely also for the.
I was hoping, Thomas, you were just going to ask, well, what problem are you trying to solve?
Well, I have an amazing idea, but I don't want to share it because no. But it's so my idea, without saying too much, is improving water qualities, reducing waste management, and implementing a mechanism for business that does these two things to finance marine protected areas.
Yeah. Yes, and I think that's like
you can help me.
Yeah, maybe that is, from what I've heard so far, this could be an idea for an environmental impact bond, right? So let's talk about that.
And you can keep it private.
Sign an NDA.
Right. Okay, but so other ideas, yeah.
Hello, thank you for this presentation. Also, just one little heads up to everyone, if you haven't listened to it, there's a Planet Money episode that just came out a week or two ago about a guy who's starting seaweed farms off the East Coast in the US, and it's really fascinating and about putting the market first and stuff like that. Can you hear me? Oh, okay. I'll talk a little louder. Okay. So I have a question, and my understanding is that there's a lot of money coming into kind of green conservation, impact investing, actually more money than is even able to be used right now. And I was wondering, is that true? Is that something that you see in this space? And yeah, I guess, you had mentioned this a little bit in your intro about having standards, and it's a worry, I guess, that the standards would be lowered on what counts as, investment in this space in order to utilize the funding that's there. And maybe it ends up having, counter consequences and actually not, doing what it's supposed to be doing. So any thoughts on that would be appreciated.
Yes, I think that's from a conservation side a key concern. How are we sure that these projects really have a positive impact on the ground? And I mentioned standardization because that's when we make projects also comparable. Because if you have one approach of doing something, and that's at an aggregated level, right? We always need to differentiate the kind of monitoring and indicators on a very specific project level, and then how do you aggregate it and communicate it so that an investor finds it interesting. And I think there we're all very excited to hear what's coming out of the COP15. What will the post-2020 global biodiversity framework look like? But I think there is a key concern, and it's exactly conservation organizations who have a keen eye on that. That's why in CPIC we have both sides, the investor side, and the investors are interested in how can they be sure that if they have to choose between two projects, they're taking the one that has the better return and the better biodiversity return. And to your other question, I'm sure you both have a lot to say on that as well. We see all the money being out there, but the question is what is it out there for? And that's the question, what is the risk appetite of that money? And when yes, there's a lot of money that would like to go in the nice and secure investments in nature that have no risks. I'm sure you're right, there's loads, but we're not there yet. And business is always risk. There's no business without risk. So again, this is the kind of getting the right risk return for investors in the private sectors, where we also need the blended financing for a project. We have in Nature Plus, where you have philanthropic money foundations, the public sector coming in for the de-risking. So it's true there is money out there that wants to go in biodiversity, but we aren't yet there on giving them the risk return that they want. But I'm sure that's something you would both like to say something about.
You want to go first?
I just make so I'm the customer that's looking for that finance. You put it the other way around. I'm in the marketplace, like looking for that money, and it's not coming. So there's something wrong in the supply chain. Yeah. And that's very supply driven kind of product that you're talking about. It's not easy to get your hands on that money. And in small countries, I'm in a country like Malawi, it's got to be available locally, because you're going to pay back. You can't send back out foreign currency. The market isn't like that. So you have to be able to access it on a local platform in a way in which you can talk to people. I want to wake up in the morning and my asset manager is in Seattle. You know, that's too far to deal with you know, a business discussion. I want to talk to somebody I can go and have lunch with. Yeah.
You know, and this is that's the reality, and both reality are actually true. And it's weird when you think about it, but at the very least, again, so I'm going to talk about the blue economy. There is just mountains of money coming our way, and then you have indeed eventually some entrepreneurs that they are not connected to those. So that's also why I've mentioned, and a very, very critical pillar is sort of this ecosystem building of partners, so we start connecting those dots, and because otherwise, indeed, then it's just not going to flow, right? And I guess just also one of the points that you made, David, about sort of the opportunity to look at those existing value chains and how to make them more sustainable, but and yet also sort of disrupt them. And it is also a lot about disruption and making something that is not yet bankable as a value chain, like fisheries, for instance. Small scale fisheries is the less bankable thing right now as it is that you can get. And yet in Europe, those fishermen, many are bankable. Right. So we need to turn this around and sort of disrupt it so that we really don't have to, and eventually sort of create an entire new value chain, because that's going to take years and years, new market, No, let's look at what's already existing is not properly done, and then disrupt it and then make the finance flow in there so that it can really sort of elevate and accelerate.
Yeah. Hello, my name is Caroline van Leenders. I work for the Dutch government, the Ministry of Agriculture and Nature. Yeah. Okay. You mentioned I've been involved in CPIC, and I think it's a great initiative. And you mentioned that you're all looking forward to the post 2020 framework of the CBD. My colleagues are in the negotiations. What do you want more than what is now in the framework? Do you have ideas that there could be other targets, maybe more detailed targets that could help, the financial system to become more focused on biodiversity? Do you have ideas as investors and thinking if this would be in the framework, that will really help us, maybe special targets on biodiversity for certain sectors or for certain financial players? I mean, I'm just trying to take it one step further. So that will be my question to you.
I think the key point is for it to be there. I said that a bit, and in a recent conversation, I said it like that. When you come from the biodiversity sphere and the conservation sphere and the kind of area that I come from, the environmental science area and technology and that, you spend a lot of time thinking about how we're going to count those butterflies. The investor just wants everybody to count the butterflies the same way. It's a bit bluntly put, but I think that's the part where investors appreciate that there is a comparability, that they know what they're getting, that they understand the indicators that are there, and that we stop arguing about which ones. I think that's maybe a very simple message, but I think that would be key, because once these standards are set, and we saw it, of course, with Salpol, we have a lot of experience in how these kind of markets develops from a climate perspective, and linking climate and biodiversity is also one of those key things that needs to happen in a large scale. But what we saw is we had Paris, and that's what the 1.5 target, and then everything around it kind of started developing, but we had a clear objective. And we don't yet have even that for biodiversity exactly. Like what is our global objective, right? We don't have the Paris Agreement for biodiversity yet. And then everything else can develop around it. So we saw it from the corporate area, where I also work with corporates in their value chains. We have the science-based targets, and now you have to set targets and an initiative, scope 1, scope 2, and most importantly, scope 3. And that can then develop because you've got that overall objective, and then you scale down and you've got one approach of doing it. And that's when you can get started. And I think that's what we need in the biodiversity area, kind of setting the kind of the pillars around, like what's our playing field, and then keep working from that. Is that helpful? Lobbying, that's we're talking to them. We're talking to investors. We absolutely do.
Yeah. I respectfully disagree. I don't think investors care. I think they want return. They want return, and they want to know a good story. They want a good story about nature.
Thanks for this very interesting presentation. Is it okay with the sound?
No, we don't have the headset. If you can speak louder.
Okay.
It's okay. I think if you just.
You talked about the ambition to scale and the necessity to scale for these businesses. Is there any kind of tipping point where the regenerative aspect can become degenerative if you scale? And how do you manage this balance between this ambition to scale and the potential effect it can have? Because the more you have business, probably the more you transform the ecosystem and how it is. Thanks.
Well, then that's a very good question indeed, and that's where science comes in, and that's absolutely key. And that's also why, again, sort of we came up this sort of Ocean Venture Studio, so that because an entrepreneur does not necessarily have access to that science, so we bring the right expert to avoid exactly that situation. Now, like simplistically put, the rate is often it becomes degenerative when it becomes intensive. So like any form of sort of very intensive type of production, often when it's sort of in natural environment, they become degrading. So yeah, sure, if you want to scale, you need space to scale. And you want to make sure that indeed sort of in terms of, because aquaculture, for instance, or ocean farming, in many places has been actually became a driver of degradation, pollution, etc. But the reality is that if it's properly done, it can actually become really a factor of regeneration. Now, of course, you need the right sort of production approach, the sort of direction, operation, etc. And and you don't have to invent it, because as a matter of fact, there is already plenty of technologies and approaches that have been developed. It's just a question of knowing about it and being able to sort of, assess basically the carrying capacity of the ecosystem, things like that. So that's where we come in. But yes, indeed, it is critical, because, like, for instance, the seaweed, the value chains in East Africa has become degrading. They started to become a driver of degradation of seagrass meadows, etc., etc. So it is critical. It is. Well, yeah, I guess, but yeah, exactly. Yeah. But you need to sort of come up with those very simple sort of ways of assessing this, so that, local community and local entrepreneur, they can see, how far can they get, and, something very straightforward. So you can just come up with a simple protocol that will help you to actually basically monitor your operation and the effect that your operation are having. So that's also why we will help them to develop such a monitoring sort of an evaluation system on biodiversity, so that it can be tracked, because that's, otherwise you don't track if you're not able to track the regenerative impact that you're having, then you're not talking about regeneration at all.
Hi, thank you for that. Thank you for this. This is really interesting. My organization works to train young people to develop projects or solutions in their communities. Sometimes that's business-based, sometimes it's organization, sometimes it's one-off. But a big challenge that we find is that finance usually goes to some of these larger, already proven successful or really largely scalable initiatives, which is great, right? We need big wins, big ideas, huge innovations. But for a lot of these small impacted communities, especially like impacted by climate change today, they need really fast wins. And sometimes it's more unique on the ground, like in the moment solutions that only the people in these communities could really develop, right? And so I think our challenge is always finding the funding to fund those smaller scale initiatives versus these really huge ones. And I was wondering if you had a perspective or information on how, whether it's better positioning or communication or like even visioning of how do we support these quick wins while we wait for the bigger wins to actually take place.
Yeah, well, maybe, and I'm sure you guys, you must have something to say, but no, that's a very, very, very critical point. And actually, so I think David, also, no, I think you mentioned the blended finance. Very interestingly, actually, sort of this blended finance sort of movement has been much more driven by the financial sector. Why? Because those guys, they had like lots of money and they wanted to do, to make it work and sort of do good for the world and say like, yeah, but, we still need to, get money out of it. So they came up with this, well, okay, so you have a lot of money, you want to put it where it should be put, okay, so we're going to de-risk it. So if there is money to be lost, then we'll lose it and then you still, earn your money. Now that thing only works when there is already something, as you say, sort of something that is able to absorb that level of funding. But what about those entrepreneurs, those like so small, those quick wins? And that's why I think we need to blend that finance even more and make it much more upstream. That means that we need to look right there, right at the beginning and say, all right, so how can we actually support right then, invest, because it's going to be an investment that's going to take like 3, 4, 5 years. And eventually after that, it's going to be able to absorb more like those more like classical blended finance type of mechanism. But that means that at the very beginning, it's like early stage, it's seed funding type of things. And that's why we are actually sort of really developing these financing facilities. And most of those indeed will have to rely heavily on sort of grant funding, but are deliberately used and framed so that they can support with the right mechanism, those businesses so that they can grow and become more bankable. But that also means, and I finish on this, is also working with the financial institution, the financial sector already existing, so that they look at the current instruments and say like, it just doesn't work with those small scale sort of, businesses. And so help them tailor those financial products so that they can also be accessible and really fit for purpose for those sort of more upstream businesses.
Yeah. You didn't say whereabouts you are, just to put it into context. Okay, you're talking global. Well, I'll just talk to where I am in Malawi and what we do. So we have a lot of these small enterprises, these income generating activities based on natural resources. And we've been working on this for a long time. A lot of those take quite a bit of time to get involved. They involve a little bit of capital, maybe some education abilities to write, read, all those sort of things. So that always gains the interest of the people in the community that do have some resources, some education. So I give you an idea of how we're now trying to get those that we would say are marginalized or more vulnerable a little bit on the outside, and it maybe relates to you a bit more on what you might think about. So we have teamed up with 2 microfinance institutions. One is, I don't know if you know the organization that's called World Vision. They've got a very local level finance facility called Vision Fund. And then there's another one based out of UK that's called Microloan Foundation. They both have offices in our local area in the remote part of Malawi. And we work with them, and we're also working with Finca. Finca doesn't like to come with skills. They'll train you about how to do business, but they don't train you on how to do fish farming or how to do beekeeping or how to grow this or whatever. So we don't have a really a strong relationship with them, but it might work with you if you're not really concerned. All you want to do is get finance to these people. So all these microfinance institutions have their way of working, which accommodates people that don't understand too much and are educated. They're not confident enough. They don't understand business. One of the new things we've done with these vulnerable women, they're usually single-headed household women, is we went into all the shops around the mountain. We looked and we said, okay, so these shops must be in business. They're selling something to these people on a daily basis. We had a look on the shelves and we said, okay, so here's polishes, there's candles, there's soaps, there's skin creams, there's a bunch of other things as well. And we looked and we thought, okay, so lots of people are doing beekeeping. There's lots of beeswax around here. We've got tea estates and the seed of the tea is thrown away each year. That's camellia oil. You put it through a cold press. We can produce tons of carrier oil, and then we have scents that come off. And so we have the product, the raw material, to pass on to these women to start making soaps, to start making oils, cooking oil, whatever, all these products, and we know they sell because that's what's in the shops in the village. So that was the idea. Then we worked with the microfinance institution to get them and to have some training and access. And there's an organization here that's making the cold presses for us, small little appropriate technology cold presses, so they can make the oil themselves. So it's just a matter of thinking about it a bit more.
I'm afraid our time is up, but I hope you learned something from this, and I want to thank everyone for sharing their ideas. And if you have questions or want to connect afterwards, please reach out, and please join CPIC. Please apply for the CFA Incubator, the Nature Plus Accelerator when that's ready. And also there's a blended finance fund, the Global Fund for Coral Reefs. We're having a session tomorrow, I think. Is it tomorrow at 4 or 4:30 at the Oceans Pavilion? So it's integrating all this stuff for profit solutions to coral reef challenges. So, and thanks again.
Thank you, David.